Gunfire at Kabul International Airport as tens of thousands of Afghan civilians try to flee the country. There have been multiple deaths reported in the airport chaos, but the death toll from the 20-year war is at least 170,000. The United States launched the war on October 7, 2001, following the September 11 attacks.
On my orders, the United States military has begun strikes against al-Qaeda terrorist training camps and military installations of the Taliban regime in Afghanistan.
The cost of the war project at Brown University estimates that more than 171,000 people have been killed in a 20-year-long war, including over 47,000 Afghan civilians, and also 2,500 U.S. soldiers. The real number of Afghan dead could be higher due to disease, loss of access to food, water, and infrastructure because of the fighting. The U.S. has spent more than $2 trillion in the last 2 decades. That's $300 million per day. Meanwhile, last year, 90% of the country's population were living on less than $2 a day, according to former President Ashraf Ghani. Former U.S. President Jimmy Carter says, in 240 years of U.S. history, it has been at peace for only 16.
If you go around the world and ask people which is the most warlike country on earth, which one do you think they would respond? The United States.
Soon after the Second World War ended, the Cold War began between the United States and the Soviet Union. This was the context for the division of the Korean Peninsula. The Korean War broke out in 1950 and lasted 3 years. U.S. bombing devastated the country. More than 3 million civilians were killed, and another 3 million became refugees. The U.S. military boasted that it had obliterated every city and town in the north. After the war, tens of thousands of families were separated for the rest of their lives. As Vietnam tried to assert its independence and defeated the French occupation, Washington claimed it had to stop what is called the spread of the communism. From November 1955, the U.S. deployed 2.7 million personnel to South Vietnam over an 18-year period to defeat insurgents seeking to liberate the whole country. It was a brutal war, and about 2 million civilians died. The U.S. and its allies dropped 2 to 3 times the number of bombs on Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia than in Europe and Asia during World War II. The U.S. also sprayed more than 19 million gallons of poison to destroy forests and crops, resulting in about 400,000 deaths and around 2 million diagnosed diseases or cancers. On October 25, 1983, Ronald Reagan launched an invasion of Grenada, claiming the tiny island nation could become a communist threat. The United Nations General Assembly condemned the attack, calling as the flagrant violation of international law. In August of 1990, Iraq invaded neighboring Kuwait after the U.S. insisted to Saddam Hussein it had no interest in the two countries' territorial dispute. Instead, after the Iraqi invasion, the U.S. gathered a massive military alliance and drove Iraq out of Kuwait, killing tens of thousands of Iraqi troops. In the years that followed the war, UNICEF reported that hundreds of thousands of children died from malnutrition and disease because of sanctions that Washington refused to lift. In March 1999, the U.S. and its NATO allies launched a 78-day bombing campaign against Serbia in what they claimed was a humanitarian war to protect ethnic Albanians in Kosovo. Thousands of civilians were killed and 1 million were displaced. The bombing caused $200 billion worth of damage, destroying bridges, schools, hospitals, broadcasting facilities, and 40% of the oil depots. In March 2003, the U.S. invaded Iraq amid claims of weapons of mass destruction that UN inspectors believed had been destroyed.
We should have never been in Iraq. We have destabilized the Middle East. They lied. They said there were weapons of mass destruction. There were none, and they knew there were none.
Like the Kosovo War, opponents declared the war illegal because it had no UN authorization. Since the invasion, hundreds of thousands of people have been killed. Weapons used by the United States included depleted uranium that continues to pollute cities and deserts. A year and a half after an Iraqi parliament resolution demanding that U.S. and other foreign troops leave the country, there are still 2,500 U.S. troops deployed there. From 2011, the U.S. and its allies spent billions of dollars supporting insurgents fighting the Syrian government then, when the insurgency became dominated by the Islamic State group. The same countries formed the military alliance against it and started another bombing campaign. In the devastated city of Raqqa, 1,600 civilians were reported killed. Meanwhile, U.S. and European sanctions have caused hunger and poverty. The World Food Program says a third of Syrians don't have enough access to food.
After a decade of conflict, in the middle of a global pandemic, and faced with a steady stream of new crises, Syria has fallen off the front page. And yet, the situation remains a living nightmare.
These are just a few of wars that U.S. has justified in the name of humanitarian intervention, democracy, and anti-terrorism. But millions of people have been killed, and entire nations have been torn apart.